why, obviously not back in 1994, but in the more recent period, BE measures have not been more tied to a set of constraints working towards productive processes, turning it into more productive processes than what it currently is. I was struck in the figure that you showed, the first figure, that all of the different sectoral empowerment programs that you were referring to were in fact hardly ever tied to longer term policy processes. And I would like to, if you could comment more on the reasons why, over time, constraints measure haven't been more attached to B. Going in the back now.
I'm interested in the continuities of government thinking or policy making. Because on the one hand, the formulation of the policy and then law and the acts and the charters that follow that happened also within the context and still happen within the context of a set of policies that say, in the new growth part, we're going to create 5 million jobs, or now we're going to aspire to 6 million opportunities, or whatever. But yet there seems to be no continuity between the scorecards, the BE process, and any sense of developing a productive economy and creating a single job. In fact, the way business receives the package is that this is a tick box of a cost. It's like taxation. It's another taxation. You do it and you do your best to get around it and front and do whatever to survive and accumulate more for yourself. So perhaps you could comment on that continuity. Secondly, insofar as government proposes this as a transformation initiative and proposes it as something that is sort of contributing in some way to nation building of some kind, the measures themselves seem to be totally out of sync with the reality of our country from a demographic point of view and from an economic point of view. What I mean when I say that is that wouldn't it have been make more sense if we weren't about empowering black people, but black was simply one measure of an empowerment as a beneficiary? Who should be the beneficiary? Is it black people? Or do we add things like language, which is critical to nation building, the capacity to speak a vernacular language? And thirdly, economic advantage, net asset value of an individual or a family. Quite an easy measure to make. If we had a weighting like that, then certainly a black bourgeois student from Michael House would score less favorably than a white working class, Xhosa-speaking person in mine, and contribute towards some real nation building in unifying people around a common purpose. So perhaps you can comment also on the measures themselves. And then the last thing I'd like to say is that, in the end of the day, they had 7 legs, they go into 5 legs of the charters, and but actually the only leg that really counted was the one where we could acquire shares and make dividends and profiteer in the ownership section of the scorecard. And what seems to have transpired is that the people who really profiteered from the ownership portions of the scorecard in the major deals were the vendor finances, the banks. The banks came in and put the money out, took the equity, and said to the aspirant black capitalists, this is even within their own frame. Let's take a risk on the stock market. If the equity performs above the strike price of those shares, and the dividend flows are good to retire the debt, the loan that we give to you for these shares, then you become an empowered person with an asset. And that was the primary instrument that they used in order to empower people. So it's not surprising that at the end of the process, however many years later, we find that on the JSE, the net asset value in so-called black hands is like less than 5%, which kind of interestingly mirrors exactly the transfer of land that's happened in the last 20 years. So, last, can you comment on that too? What was the thinking of government?
Sorry?
What was the thinking of government? Even within their own frame. If the project was to build an elite with real capital, it kind of failed in that sense too.
Well, I don't know how I can give satisfactory answers to those at all. I think I'm going to try and tackle Gavin's questions first, to some extent. The issue about there doesn't seem to be any link between scorecards and production, etc. And I would agree with you. Partly there's the measurement issue. How on earth do we measure those issues anyway? But the other thing is, I'd rather suspect that despite all the hullabaloo about BE, large-scale capital recognises BE as a cost. There's a lot of moaning around the raising the cost is going to deter investment, etc., etc. But if you look around the world, BE type measures are by no means unique to South Africa. Perhaps they've been more explicit in some ways in this part of the continent because of the particular apartheid background and obviously the emphasis upon race. But I don't think that if you look, from Malaysia is one obvious example where similar policies have been implemented. Now, as far as international investors are concerned, there are all sorts of obstacles going into all sorts of markets, and BE is just, I think, partly we can say that my guess is, and it's a guess, that large-scale capital regards in many ways BE partly as a cost which has to be borne, and then gets on with the job. I think the other aspect which we could also say why hasn't it really worked? It's because despite a lot of the more grandiose aims, the thrust of BE, perhaps particularly under the Mbeki regime, was about ownership and control. Was rather about extending black entry into corporate ownership. And it was a process of, in terms of the NWW rent scenario, this is a classic case of granting rents to black elites rather than incorporating, rather than the creating of a black capitalist class. There's a lot, Zuma laments these days the lack of a black industrial class, but clearly the BE model, what it did not do was to create a black industrial class. Of course, there are individuals who have been very active in promoting enterprises, but I think some of the more successful, if you like, black entrepreneurs have not come out of BE as we tend to know it lately, but they tend to precisely come out of that 1980s period. We're talking about people like Wendy de Harvey, Patrice Motsepe, and so on. So BE itself doesn't seem to have really done anything about boosting production as such. So I think it's been about, as you said, extending the rents from the accumulation process to politically connected areas. And I think, picking up on Mcebisi's terms, I think there probably has been a shift since 2007. And I think that we see there are, my guess is that quite a lot of the black business types who were threw their lot in behind Zuma between 2005 and 2007. In many ways, it's a little bit of a repeat of the process going up to 1998 in the BEC Commission. My guess is, and it's a guess, that these people were the people who felt left out under Mbeki, and they thought that coming in under Zuma, they would get greater access to the chances of accessing contracts with the state, etc. And again, the process is not upon productive class or becoming an entrepreneurial class. It is exactly around gaining access to rent. Now, maybe if we go back in the past, if we look at the way in which capitalist classes have been formed historically, probably you will find over a long period some sorts of very similar processes. But of course, that is not the objective of policy. The objective of the policy is supposedly to build a black capitalist class. And one of the problems is that coming into this process, on the whole, blacks didn't have capital. So they had to be given it by the state. They had to be given it, they're either given it by the state in terms of tenders, or they're given it by the banks in terms of debts and loans and so forth. And so therefore, they're tied to existing large corporate capital. Gavin, I'm not quite sure I got your second question, but I think what you're essentially pointing out to is the contrast, I think we're pointing in the paper, between the very broad aspirations that BE has put forward in the original conceptualization of BE as genuinely empowering black people, which has got lost in the whole process of legislation and has become narrowed down to scorecard ticking and to with a much narrower focus upon ownership. I think one of the interesting things which Don went in the direction of is what we actually need by empowerment. And I think that when we're looking at that term, black economic empowerment, the emphasis is much more upon the word black than upon the word empowerment. I don't see those discussions in the media or even in government policy of what actually is meant by empowerment. It is seen as it is reduced to various instruments, is what is percentage of shareholding by blacks, how many blacks have we got here, and so on and forth. It is not about that longer term process of seriously skilling people, giving them decent education, giving them the socio-economic, psychological background where they can actually take control of their own lives, which would seem to be a proper notion of empowerment. So when it comes to those first two questions, what to be done to make BE more productive, I really can't give you an easy answer because I don't have that. Because on one hand, clearly we have massive backlogs in genuine black empowerment, and that goes down to the educational system, etc. If you're going to produce people who are genuinely empowered in modern industrialized economies, then you have to produce people with all sorts of access to skills and resources and so on and so forth. And clearly that's a long time exercise. It probably goes across generations, but it also means going into sorting out some very long-term problems in terms of schooling and so on within our country. But the problem with the political situation is that understandably the large majority of black people in this country is still impoverished or quite impatient. And so there is a huge disconnect, I think, between what might be genuine process of empowerment and what people want in the short term. And I think one of the problems is that if you take short cuts to empowerment, I'm not quite sure what you get. But you certainly get, what you are getting is in some aspect you're getting a distortion of what true empowerment should be in terms of vice, corruption, entrepreneurship and so on.
Briefly, there's 2 points. Firstly, to agree with Roger's first point, that the social justice call it subconscious, is a logical conclusion of the post-colonial project. Very few post-colonial states, I don't think there are any who haven't pursued that project, because, as you know, apartheid capital accumulation was based purely on land dispossession and exploitation of land labor. So that was suddenly created a source of grievance, which has always been part of nationalist movements. And when nationalist movements come in power, redress is necessarily part of that post-colonial settlement. In fact, South Africa's project has been renewed, comparatively speaking. Other post-colonial settlements have included confiscation of central capital and even chasing away settlers or white community within those society. So it's not peculiar to South Africa. Perhaps it hasn't. It's not as radical as one particular say compared to other post-colonial states. Zimbabwe is an extreme national. The second point. So you could do nation formation in various ways, including the aim also through language and culture. One does not necessarily do that; they can all be undertaken simultaneously. The second point on the failure of being, for me, it's about the fractured nature of black business, specifically in the last 5 or so years. Yes, everyone agrees that there should be some level of racial redress, but they each wants a bigger share of that more than the other. And therefore you have this factionalism fighting amongst each other, and that tends to undermine the cohesiveness of the project. We've had NAFCO, recently we have BCC, we have Business South Africa, all of them claiming to represent black business and using different instruments towards that. So for me, the failure rests one primarily with the lack of cohesion within the class itself, fraternity of the class, and which undermines a more concerted effort towards a black accumulation project. That's primarily the major problem.
Right, Gavin, you were next, and then you at the side, and then right back there.
Thanks. So mine is more of an analytical question, or maybe better a nerd's question. And the nerd's question is, does the panel know, or does anyone else know, of any serious class analyses for black economic empowerment elites? And the key word there is serious, by which I mean refined. Because I think, for good reasons, at a certain level of abstraction, we tend to talk about black capitalist class, we tend to talk about black bourgeoisie. But actually, when you start to look at it a little bit closer, a little bit concretely, about what we're talking about, we're lumping together actually quite different categories and means of appropriating surpluses. Accumulation tends to get thrown around a lot as well. So for example, if I were to look at the upper echelons of black economic empowerment elites, as I mentioned earlier, most of this is people who are holding pieces of paper, which is a claim of surplus value, which is going to be produced by somebody else, which have a value and traded. And as Gavin reminded us earlier, those pieces of paper are often funded by finance houses, and who often also, or the companies finance them, are often paying the interest on them as well. So that becomes quite confusing when you start to think about this in class terms. Picture. Now in reality, these different locations may very often be combined in the same entity or even person. One can be a shareholder and a minister, for example. But I think it's important that we do actually start to disaggregate this a little bit and get a little more refined. And I certainly feel a little bit queasy when I keep on hearing the term accumulation. Maybe I'm a little bit old school, but I think of accumulation purely in terms of the extraction of surplus value and then the reinvestment of surplus value to create more surplus value. That sort of suggests some sort of control over the process of production itself. Actually holding a piece of paper constitutes its money capital. then your relationship with production is much more mediated, much more complex, and indeed you may exercise no real control whatsoever. So I just wondered really whether we could open up a conversation around that sort of level of analysis and see where it leads us, maybe even politically.
On his treatment of a black business elite as a homogeneous class, to begin to say that prior to 2007, they have been more organized, and in the current phase, they are disorganized is a bit misplaced. And secondly, I just want to get a reaction from Roger insofar as the role of the black bourgeoisie is concerned. But more importantly, the current challenge of fronting, because we have also seen in the recent past that most of the so-called business elites are not genuine in their credentials. They simply represent their face rather than the genuine experience that goes with business. And the last question really, it's about the hypocrisy that is